I thought I knew who lived in my house. It was supposed to be me. But one Friday evening, I came home from work and saw a strange car parked in my driveway. At first, I thought someone had made a mistake. Then I noticed something even stranger. There were lights on inside my house. I hadn't left them on. I slowly walked toward the front door, and that's when I heard voices. Someone was inside. I opened the door, and standing in my living room was the president of my HOA, Linda Carter. She looked at me like I was the one who had walked into the wrong house. Then she calmly said, "Oh, you're home." I stared at her. "What are you doing in my house?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pointed toward the furniture and said the HOA had been taking care of the property. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was my house. I had bought it 2 years earlier. I had the keys. I paid the mortgage. I paid the property taxes. And yet the HOA president was standing in my living room as if she owned the place. I asked her to leave. She refused. She said the HOA had authority over the property because of a community ownership provision. That was the first moment I realized this wasn't some simple misunderstanding. Someone had been telling Linda that she had rights to my house. But who? And why? I called the police. When officers arrived, Linda immediately started explaining that she was the HOA president and that the property was subject to community rules. One officer asked her a simple question: "Do you have proof that you own this house?" She didn't. Instead, she produced a folder containing HOA documents. But none of them showed ownership. They only showed community rules and association information. The officers told everyone to remain calm and advised us to resolve the property dispute through official records. Linda eventually left, but before she walked out, she looked at me and said, "You're going to regret challenging the association." That sentence stayed in my head all night. The next morning, I went straight to the county records office. I asked for the complete property history. Not the HOA documents, not neighborhood rules, the deed, the actual deed. A clerk pulled up the property record, and that's when things became interesting. The deed showed that I was a legal owner. There was no HOA ownership interest listed, no transfer to the association, no clause giving the HOA the right to occupy my home. But there was something else. An older document from when the neighborhood was developed. It referenced a shared maintenance agreement. Linda had apparently interpreted that agreement as giving the HOA control over individual properties. It didn't. It only covered certain common areas and maintenance responsibilities. My house wasn't one of them. I took copies of everything. Then I contacted a property attorney. He reviewed the documents carefully. After several minutes, he looked at me and said, "Your HOA president may have a serious misunderstanding about what the association actually owns." I showed him photographs of Linda inside my house. He told me to document everything. So I did. I photographed the locks, the rooms, the furniture, everything that had been moved. Then I checked my security cameras. That's when I discovered something I hadn't expected. Linda hadn't just entered once. She had been coming to the property repeatedly, sometimes during the afternoon, sometimes while I was at work. And on one occasion, she had brought another HOA board member with her. They had apparently convinced themselves that they had authority over the property. But they had never asked me. They had never obtained permission. And they had never produced a deed. The attorney sent a formal notice to the HOA. The response came 2 days later. The board claimed they had acted in good faith. But they also agreed to stop entering my property. I thought that was the end. It wasn't. The HOA scheduled an emergency community meeting. Linda stood in front of dozens of homeowners and tried to explain what had happened. She said the association had been trying to protect neighborhood property values. Then she claimed I had misunderstood the community agreement. I stood up. I didn't argue. I simply placed a copy of my deed on the table. Then I placed the older development agreement beside it. I told everyone, "Let's compare them." The room became quiet. The deed clearly identified me as a property owner. The HOA agreement clearly described common areas, and nowhere did it transfer ownership of my house to the association. Linda looked at the documents. Then she looked around the room. For the first time, she didn't have an answer. One homeowner finally asked, "So why were you living in his house?" Nobody spoke. Linda tried to explain that she believed the property was under HOA control, but the documents said otherwise. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Within the following weeks, the HOA issued a written correction. They acknowledged that my property was privately owned and that association members had no right to enter without permission. The locks were changed, the security system was upgraded, and the HOA president never came near my house again. But I kept one copy of the deed framed on my office wall. Not because I needed to prove that I owned the house in the mall, because I had learned something important. A title isn't just a piece of paper. It is a history of who legally owns a property. Rules can be misunderstood. HOA board can make mistakes. And people can act confident even when they're completely wrong. But when someone walks into your home claiming they own it, don't argue. Don't shout. Check the deed. Because sometimes the smallest document in the room can completely destroy the biggest claim. And in my case, that one piece of paper didn't just prove I owned my house. It proved the HOA president had never owned it at all. If you enjoyed this HOA story, like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from.